I am Emily Carter, 33 years old. And like so many daughters, I thought love and loyalty could hold a family together. I worked, I paid, I fixed every crack in the walls, even emptied $80,000 from my savings to rescue the house that carried all our memories. On New Year's Day, with snow still on the ground and the smell of coffee drifting through my parents' kitchen, I opened a folder that changed everything. In that moment, I learned just how far betrayal can hide behind the word family. What I found left me shaken to my core, and the days that followed proved even more devastating. Would you have the strength to walk away, or would you keep sacrificing? Stay with me, because what unfolded after that discovery will make you question how much one heart can endure. Let me take you back to where it began. It was the first morning of the new year, January 1st, 2024, when I drove across Portland to my parents' house. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes your breath visible as you step outside. Their two-story colonial sat on a quiet street lined with bare maples, a house I had poured myself into for years, patching its roof, painting its shutters, wiring money every month just to keep it standing. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee and my mother's orchids filled the air. She was at the dining table in her robe papers, stacked in uneven piles around her. She smiled when I walked in, weary but warm, and said she was relieved I had come by. My mother, Linda, never trusted technology. Bills confused, her online accounts were a maze, and she leaned on me to keep things in order. "Can you take a quick look through these papers?" she asked, shuffling a stack toward me. I nodded, sat down, and began sorting. Receipts, utility bills, a bank statement from December. My father, Robert, was in the living room sipping his coffee with the morning news turned low. The house was quiet except for the creak of the furnace and the ticking of the old clock above the mantel. I was halfway through the pile when my fingers touched a thick cream envelope tucked beneath a folder. My eyes caught the bold letters on the front. "Estate plan and will." I froze. For a second, I told myself to put it back, that it was none of my business. But another part of me, the part that had spent a decade paying their bills and holding the family together, said I had every right to know what was inside. I slid the papers free, unfolded the stapled pages, and my eyes moved straight to the section labeled Distribution of Assets. My chest tightened. Every line of property and possession, from the house, valued at $420,000, to the SUV parked in the driveway. Even my mother's wedding ring was assigned to one name, Megan Carter, my younger sister. I read again, looking for my own name. All I found was a single vague line. "We love both our daughters." Nothing more. Heat rose in my chest. I gripped the paper so tight my knuckles whitened. Images flashed in my mind all those nights. I stayed up late finishing extra work to cover their mortgage the winter. I climbed onto the roof in the rain to patch shingles before the water seeped in the morning. I emptied my savings to pay $80,000 so the bank wouldn't foreclose. I had poured every ounce of myself into this house, into them believing sacrifice meant security. I didn't hear my mother step back into the room until she was behind me. "Emily, did you find the tax statement?" she asked, lightly unaware of what I held. I stood slowly, turned, and held up the will. My voice came out low and calm, too calm for how my heart was pounding. "Is this real?" Her eyes flickered to the papers, then back to me. "Oh," she whispered, her hand fluttering near her chest. "Emily, Before she could finish, I cut her off, my throat tight but my words sharp. "A lifetime of keeping this house alive and I am written off like I don't exist." My father appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand. He set it down on the counter with a sigh, as if he were commenting on the weather. "You don't need to make a scene, Emily. You're doing fine. Megan is still figuring things out." I let out a laugh that sounded like sandpaper. Figuring things out. She is 30 years old, changes jobs every few months, lives off YouTube videos, and has never paid a bill on time. And I am the one who has carried your mortgage for 3 years, the one who fixed your roof last winter, the one who has kept this house standing dollar by dollar. My mother stepped closer, her hand reaching for mine. "Don't overthink it. We just wanted your sister to feel secure. I pulled my hand away. Secure? And what about me? The one who held you both up when you would have fallen. They said nothing. My father looked at the floor, my mother's lips trembled, but no words came. The silence pressed heavy in the room. I placed the will back on the table with a steady hand as if returning a weapon. Thank you for showing me where I stand. Without another glance, I picked up my coat from the chair, walked to the door, and stepped into the icy January air. The sound of the door closing behind me was sharp, final, and for the first time in years I didn't feel hurt. I felt hollow, a quiet emptiness that chilled me more than the winter wind. I drove away from the house, without looking back, gripping the wheel until my fingers ached, the weight of a decade of sacrifice pressing against the realization that in their eyes I had never truly mattered. The week that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. I went to work at the Arts Center, smiled when people wished me a Happy New Year, and forced myself to go through the motions. Yet every night when I turned out the lights in my apartment, the image of that will returned like a shadow I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself that silence was better than another round of disappointment, that I would let them come to me if they cared enough to reach out. 7 days later, just as the sun was dipping behind the buildings outside my window, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from a colleague or maybe a friend checking in. Instead, I saw my father's name. Mortgage is due. That was it. 3 words, plain and cold, as if nothing had happened, as if the will had never been uncovered, as if I had not stood in their dining room choking back years of betrayal. My hand went slack. I stared at the words so long that the screen dimmed and went dark. I pressed it awake again just to be sure I had read it right. No mention of how I felt. No acknowledgement of the fight or the tears in my mother's eyes. Just a reminder, as though my existence had boiled down to one function, one duty: to pay. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might cry. But the tears didn't come. Instead, something colder settled in. I typed back slowly, each letter deliberate. Ask your heir. I hit send and placed the phone face down on the counter. My heart pounded in my ears, and a shaky laugh slipped out, humorless and dry. For the first time, I had told him no without softening it, without promising to think about it, without hesitation. Minutes stretched into an hour. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the city lights flicker on in the distance. My phone remained dark and silent. A part of me wondered if they would finally realize how deep they had cut me, but another part already knew better. It was close to 9 when the screen lit again. This time it was my mother. Hannah, don't do this. We need to talk. Please. I stared at her words, my hands trembling slightly. For years I had dropped everything whenever she said please. I had believed her voice carried authority, that she could bend me back into place, no matter how far I tried to pull away. But this time felt different. The calm inside me was like glass. I set the phone down without replying. The night outside was quiet, only the hum of traffic in the distance. I curled beneath my blanket, closed my eyes, and listened to the silence. It didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like freedom. The next morning, my phone buzzed while I was brushing my teeth. Another message from my father. No greeting, no explanation. We need that payment today. Deadline is Friday. My jaw clenched. I placed the phone face down on the sink and let the water run. A small part of me wanted to storm into their house and throw the phone in his lap and ask how he could be so blind. But I knew it would not matter. They had already decided who was worth securing. At lunch, I sat in the staff kitchen at the Arts Center, scrolling through my phone. A new message waited from Megan. You're overreacting. Mom and Dad didn't mean it like that. You've always been independent, and I'm just not. You know that. Independent. That word cut deeper than she realized. For her, independence meant I didn't need anything, didn't deserve anything. For me, it meant I had been forced to grow strong because no one else carried the weight. I typed back slowly, my fingers steady. Then, prove you deserve what you've been given. Start with the mortgage. I pressed send and slipped the phone into my bag. There was no response, not that day, not the next. By Thursday evening, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table staring at the same phone, half expecting it to buzz again. The silence stretched thick and heavy. I thought about all the years of saving receipts, of logging into accounts at midnight, because my mother had forgotten a password, of climbing ladders with freezing hands while Megan slept in. My chest felt heavy, but it wasn't sorrow. It was clarity, sharp and clean. On Friday morning, as the rain drummed against my window, another message came, this time from my mother. Mortgage is due. Please transfer it. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, only a withdrawal request, like I was, an account they could access. I sat frozen, staring at the words, the steam from my coffee curling past my face. Then, with a calmness that surprised me, I declined the request. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. My mother's name flashed across the screen. I let it buzz until the fourth ring, then pressed decline. A text followed instantly. "Emily, I know you saw it. Why did you decline?" I drew in a breath, exhaled slowly, and typed, "Because it's no longer my responsibility. Ask Megan." I set the phone aside and leaned back in my chair. The rain kept falling steady and endless, and for the first time in years I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. I was not their lifeline anymore. That night, as I folded laundry in the quiet of my apartment, a thought crossed my mind. They would not stop here. They would circle back again and again until someone broke. But this time it would not be me. I placed the last shirt on the pile, turned off the light, and stood in the darkness listening to the sound of the rain against the glass. It was the sound of something ending and something else, something fragile but real, just beginning. The following week unfolded with a strange rhythm, as if each day carried a test of my resolve. On Monday morning, just as I was pulling into the parking lot at the arts center, my phone vibrated with another message. This time it was longer, my mother pleading in her careful words. "Emily, please reconsider. The mortgage is $2,000 this month. We can't make it without you." I sat in the driver's seat, my hands frozen on the wheel. It was not the number that stung. It was the casual assumption that the obligation was mine. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. My mother's words brought back images of the past nights when I worked double shifts to scrape together enough to cover that very bill. Times when I slipped cash into her purse so she would not have to feel embarrassed. The memories rose and fell like waves, and I realized they had trained me to equate love with sacrifice. By the time I walked into the building, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Megan. Her message carried none of the softness of my mother's. "You're being so selfish. Didn't you always say family comes first?" I leaned against the hallway wall, staring at her words. Family. The word itself felt warped. For them, it meant a free safety net, a guarantee. For me, it had meant sleepless nights and endless giving. My fingers moved over the screen. Family is about fairness and respect, not using someone until they break. I pressed send, tucked the phone away, and forced myself to smile at the receptionist as if nothing in my world had shifted. The messages slowed after that, like a storm wearing itself out, but the silence that followed was heavier than noise. 3 days later, as I was stirring soup in my kitchen, my phone buzzed with another request. This time it was not a text but an automated transfer from my mother's account. $2,000 sent as if I were still tethered to their bills. I stared at the screen, my hand tightening around the wooden spoon. Decline. I pressed it without hesitation. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. I let it buzz, watching my mother's name appear and disappear. A text followed almost instantly. "Emily, I know you saw it. Why did you decline?" I set the spoon down, wiped my hands on a towel, and typed slowly. "Because it is no longer my responsibility. Ask Megan." My thumb lingered over the screen before I hit send. The words were ice, but they were also truth. After that, the silence became something different. It was not the aching kind I had carried for years, waiting for recognition. It was a silence of consequence. I told myself they would eventually realize the weight had shifted, that the burden now rested on Megan's shoulders where they had chosen to place it. That weekend, as I sat with a book on my couch, a memory surfaced uninvited. It was from 4 years earlier when my father had fallen ill suddenly and landed in the hospital. The bills came fast and stacked high, and I had signed papers without hesitation, taking on debts just to keep things moving. Megan had shown up once, clutching a coffee, offering nothing but excuses about being between jobs. I remembered the way my mother had looked at me then, not with gratitude, but with expectation, as if this was my role by design. I shook the memory away and returned to my book, but the bitterness lingered like an aftertaste. The next morning I checked my phone before heading out the door. Another message from Megan. This one longer, more frantic. Are you seriously going to let the power be shut off? Are you going to let us live in the dark? I stared at the screen, then typed back a single sentence. I am letting you face the consequences of your choices. I set the phone down, grabbed my coat, and left for work. That afternoon, while setting up for a workshop, a familiar voice called my name. I turned to see Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor who had known my parents for more than 20 years. She had a grocery bag slung over one arm, her silver hair pulled back neatly. "Emily, I just wanted to check in," she said, lowering her voice. "Your parents got another letter from the bank. I think it is serious." I swallowed hard. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice polite but distant. She studied me for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more, then patted my arm and left. When the room was empty again, I sat in one of the folding chairs, my hands clasped in my lap. It was happening faster than I expected. Weeks, not months, and the cracks were already showing. I thought of the roof I had patched, the water heater I had replaced, the endless nights of worrying about bills that were never really mine. The house was unraveling without me, and part of me ached at the thought, but another part whispered that this was the proof I needed. That night, as rain swept across Portland, I sat by my window, the city lights blurred through the glass. My phone lay silent on the table. No new messages, no demands. For the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the quiet without rushing to fix it. It was unsettling, yes, but inside that stillness was something I had never allowed before. Space. Space for myself, for my own life, for the possibility of choosing without the constant weight of obligation pressing down. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain, telling myself that no matter what storm came next, I would not step back into the role they had written for me. The silence held, but I knew it would not last. The following morning, I woke with a heaviness that felt different, as if my body knew something was shifting even before I admitted it to myself. I walked into the kitchen, made coffee, and stared at the row of sticky notes taped along the edge of my fridge. Each one was a reminder I had created months ago, small deadlines for bills I had paid on their behalf. Power due the 12th, gas the 17th, water the 20th. It looked like a wall of obligations I no longer recognized as mine. I stood there for a long time, coffee cooling in my hands, then slowly peeled one note away. The sound of the paper tearing free was softer than I expected. One by one, I removed the rest. By the time I finished the fridge, door was bare, and in that emptiness, I felt something almost like relief. That afternoon, I logged into the joint account I had once set up for my parents' mortgage and utilities. My name sat there like a chain I had dragged behind me for years. My hands shook as I clicked through the screens. Remove signer. Confirm. The final message popped up asking me if I was sure, and my breath caught in my throat. I thought of all the nights I had lost sleep because of these bills, all the times I skipped things I wanted for myself. Then I pressed confirm. It felt like slamming a door. My chest expanded with a breath I had not realized I was holding. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence of my apartment. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly louder, the rain outside tapping steadily against the window. That evening, I pulled open the small drawer in my desk where I kept every receipt, every statement I had saved just in case they asked for proof. Piles of papers showing thousands of dollars I had poured into that house. I gathered them together, slid them into a manila envelope, and placed it in the back of the drawer. I told myself I did not need to justify anything anymore, but I wanted the record for me as a reminder of how much I had carried. For dinner, I bought myself a chocolate cake from the corner bakery, the kind I had always walked past but never let myself buy. I sliced a piece, sat at the table, and ate it slowly. Each bite tasted like rebellion, like reclaiming something small but deeply mine. Later, I lit a candle and put on music. I loved the songs I had once turned down low so I could hear my phone in case my parents called. This time, I turned it up loud enough to fill the room. I lay back on the couch and let the sound wash over me. The next morning, I woke without that familiar knot in my stomach. No notification buzzed reminding me of a bill. No deadline loomed. I walked to the window and looked out over the street, the sun breaking through thin clouds, and I realized how foreign peace felt. At work that day, I caught myself smiling more easily, even laughing at a joke one of my coworkers made. Marcus noticed. He tilted his head and asked if I was finally getting more sleep. I nodded and said, maybe I was. I did not explain why, but inside I knew. The weight I had carried for years was no longer pressing against my shoulders. That weekend, I cleaned my apartment from top to bottom, almost like a ritual. Dusting shelves, scrubbing the bathroom, washing the windows until they gleamed. When I finished, I stood in the middle of my living room, looking at the tidy space, and it felt like starting over. For the first time in a long time, I let myself imagine what I might want for me. I pulled out my laptop and signed up for an online art class I had always pushed aside, telling myself I had no time. I clicked register, smiling as the confirmation email popped up. That night, I opened a notebook I had kept hidden in the back of a drawer. The first pages were lists of expenses from my parents' notes on due dates and customer service numbers. I flipped past them and found empty sheets at the back. Slowly, with a pen I had saved, for years I wrote down what I wanted. Travel, a new camera, time to teach without worrying about bills. The words looked strange on the page, like they belonged to someone else, but seeing them there made me feel lighter. By Sunday, I noticed I had slept through the night without waking to check my phone. I poured coffee, sat by the window, and realized that silence no longer felt threatening. It felt earned. Of course I knew it would not last. My parents and Megan would not give up easily. But sitting there with sunlight warming the floor, I promised myself I would not go back. The quiet in my apartment that weekend was not emptiness anymore. It was space. Space to breathe, space to dream, space that had been denied to me for too long. And as I set my cup down, I felt the faintest flicker of anticipation, knowing the storm from them was still coming, but for once I was ready to face it. 2 days later, the first sign of the storm arrived in the form of a voicemail from my mother. Her voice cracked and wavered as she explained that the internet had been shut off, that she and my father did not know what to do. I listened once, standing by the sink with my hands wet from rinsing dishes, then deleted it without replying. That evening, as I was leaving the arts center, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Megan. "You really think it is okay to leave them like this? You are heartless." I stopped in the parking lot, staring at her words under the dim yellow lights. For years, she had been the one shielded from responsibility, living in apartments she could barely afford, drifting between jobs. Now she wanted to call me heartless for finally refusing to bail them out. My hands were steady as I typed. "I think it is time you learned what it feels like to stand on your own." The response never came. By Thursday, another message appeared from my mother. "The landline is cut. Your father is upset. Megan says she cannot figure out the account." I closed my eyes and breathed in through my nose. I remembered how many times I had kept notebooks full of passwords and customer service numbers. I even knew which hold music played at which company. I walked to my bookshelf, opened the old spiral notebook where I had carefully written every code and instruction. I flipped through the pages, my mother's needs written in my own handwriting. Then I closed it, slid it back on the shelf, and left it there. Friday morning, while I was pouring coffee, my phone rang with Mrs. Thompson's name on the screen. She was the neighbor who had known my family forever, the one who used to bring over cookies on Christmas. I answered because she had never once asked me for money. "Emily," she said in her gentle voice, "I don't mean to pry, but your parents got a letter from the bank. I think it is serious." She hesitated. It said foreclosure notice. The word struck like a weight in my stomach. I gripped the edge of the counter. "Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Thompson," I managed to say. I kept my tone calm, though my pulse was racing. After we hung up, I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the steam rising from my mug. I had known this moment would come. I had told myself that the house was never mine, that my years of sacrifice would not secure a line in that will. Still, the thought of foreclosure came like a punch. For a brief moment, I imagined the walls, I had painted the roof, I had repaired the place, I had poured myself into being listed as a property for sale. The ache swelled in my chest, but instead of reaching for my phone to fix it, I sat down at the table and folded my hands. "This is not mine to carry," I whispered to myself. They made their choice. That afternoon at work, I tried to focus on setting up easels and arranging brushes for the high school art class, but my mind kept drifting. I remembered the snowy night when I drove across town with groceries because my mother called saying they had nothing in the fridge. I remembered wiring money on the very morning I should have been paying my own rent. Every memory of rescue piled up like bricks, and each one reminded me of how easily I had been erased. Later that evening, Megan's number flashed across my phone. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice was sharp, almost frantic. "Are you seriously going to just let them lose the house? Are you going to stand by and watch?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "I am not letting anything happen. I am simply refusing to keep fixing what was never mine." She went quiet on the other end, her breathing shallow. Then she whispered, "You are really selfish." The line went dead. I sat in the silence afterward, the words echoing in my ears. Selfish. For years I had been the opposite of selfish giving, and giving until there was nothing left. Now, standing my ground was the label they wanted to slap on me. But the truth was selfishness had kept me alive this time. On Sunday morning, I went for a walk through Laurelhurst Park. The winter air was sharp against my face, and the sound of ducks on the pond filled the quiet. Families walked by with strollers, couples held hands, and I let myself breathe. For the first time, I was living without the constant fear of their bills looming. Halfway around the pond, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Megan. "Power is about to be shut off. Are you really going to let that happen?" I stopped on the path, reading her words while the wind rustled through the bare branches above. My thumbs moved quickly without hesitation. "I am letting you take responsibility for your own life." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking. By evening, as I lit a candle in my apartment, I realized something had shifted. The desperation in their voices, the panic in their texts, all pointed to one thing. Without me, the structure they leaned on was collapsing. And for the first time, I was not rushing to hold it up. I sat in the glow of the candlelight, feeling both sadness and relief. It was not joy, not triumph. It was the quiet recognition that a chapter of my life was ending. The silence that followed was not the absence of love. It was the presence of boundaries. And though I knew the storm had only begun, I also knew I was no longer the one who would be struck first. It was late on a gray Tuesday when the knock came at my apartment door. The sound startled me sharp and hurried, as if the person on the other side could hardly wait for me to answer. I set my mug of tea on the counter and opened the door to find Megan standing there. Her face pale, her hair pulled back messily, clutching a thick stack of papers in her hands. She looked nothing like the carefree sister who used to post selfies from bars and weekend trips. Her hoodie was wrinkled, her eyes swollen, and she seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of responsibility had finally settled on her shoulders. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, blocking her way. 5 minutes, she blurted, her voice cracking. "Just give me 5 minutes, Emily." I didn't move aside. "You here to ask for money?" I asked quietly. "Not money," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I just need your help talking to the bank. I don't understand these terms and they keep calling and I'm so overwhelmed." Her fingers trembled as she held the papers out toward me like an offering. I glanced at them but made no move to take them. "What about the inheritance?" I said. "You have the house, the SUV, the accounts. Isn't that what Mom and Dad wanted?" She looked down at the floor, her voice dropping. "It's tied up in investments. If I withdraw now, I get hit with penalties. I thought things would work themselves out. I thought Mom and Dad had it under control. I didn't think it would spiral this fast. I let out a dry laugh, the kind that carried no humor. That's the problem, Megan. You never think. You've coasted through every storm assuming someone else will patch the holes. Usually me. Her lips pressed together, her eyes glistening. I know, she whispered. I know I've been careless, but this is bigger than me. I don't know what to do. I stepped outside the doorway, closing the door behind me so she wouldn't wander in. The hallway smelled faintly of someone's dinner garlic, and onions simmering, grounding me in the ordinariness of life. I faced her squarely. This is the lesson you need to learn, I said, my tone steady. Everyone stumbles. But no one grows if someone is always there to catch them before they hit the ground. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. She just stood there holding those papers like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. Her voice was small when she finally spoke. You're really going to let them lose the house? I shook my head slowly. I'm not letting anything happen. I'm stepping back. They made their choice. They put everything in your name, not mine. So now you live with that choice. Her shoulders slumped. The papers in her hands shook, then slid slightly, almost falling to the floor before she caught them again. You don't understand, she whispered. I do, I said. More than you think. We stood in silence for a long moment, the air heavy between us. Finally, I turned the knob behind me. I hope you figure it out, Megan. Really, I do. But I won't fix it for you. I stepped inside and shut the door gently, the click of the lock final in my ears. I stood there for a long moment, leaning against the door, listening to her muffled footsteps fade down the hallway. That night I couldn't stop replaying the look in her eyes. Desperation, fear, maybe even regret. But beneath it, there was still that old entitlement, the expectation that I would cave. I made myself a promise as I crawled into bed. Not this time. 2 days later, while I was walking through the local grocery store, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen to see her name again. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was shaky, full of nerves. The bank wants to meet, she said. They're talking foreclosure timelines and I can't follow any of it. Please, Emily, just come with me. I don't need money, I just need you to explain. I pushed the cart down the aisle, slowly staring at the shelves of cereal. My voice came out calm. You signed the papers, Megan. You accepted the inheritance. That means you accepted the responsibility too. There was silence on the other end, then a quiet sob. I can't do this alone. You can, I said firmly. You just don't want to. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. My hands were steady as I reached for a box of oatmeal, as though even the simple act of choosing for myself reminded me that my life no longer belonged to their demands. That evening, as I folded laundry in the soft glow of my lamp, I thought again of the roof I had climbed to fix in the middle of a storm, of the hospital bills I had signed, of the checks I had written when Megan's car broke down. Each memory was proof of how long I had been their safety net, and each one reminded me of why I had to let go. By the time I slid the last shirt into the drawer, my phone sat silent on the table. I knew she would call again, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But I also knew my answer would not change. For the first time, I felt the boundaries I had drawn hold steady, no cracks forming under the weight of guilt. The storm outside my family's walls was theirs to weather now, not mine. A week later, I found myself sitting in a small office downtown, the faint hum of traffic outside, mixing with the ticking of an old clock on the wall. I had scheduled the appointment with Mr. Hayes, a lawyer I knew from my years volunteering at the community center. He was in his late 50s, his graying hair, neatly combed glasses perched low on his nose. He welcomed me with the same calm voice I remembered, asked about my work at the art center, then leaned forward, hands folded. What brings you here today, Emily? I hesitated, then slid a copy of the will across his desk. My hands trembled slightly as I watched him skim the pages. I told him about discovering it on New Year's Day, about being completely excluded, despite all I had given, about the constant demands for money, even after the truth came out. He listened quietly, his eyes moving steadily over the text. When he finally set the papers down, he let out a quiet sigh. Emily, I need to be honest with you. Legally, this will is solid. Your parents were of sound mind when they wrote it, and unless you can prove coercion or fraud, there is no way to challenge it. The words sank heavy into my chest, though I had already suspected as much. So I have no claim, I asked softly. He shook his head. Not unless your parents decide to amend it, and that would be entirely up to them. I sat back in the chair, the leather creaking under my weight. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Years of sacrifice erased with a line of ink, and the law had nothing to say about it. Mr. Hayes leaned forward again, his voice gentle. Emily, I can see this hurts you deeply, but I also need you to hear me. You do not owe them another dollar. You are not legally responsible for that mortgage, for those utilities, for any of it. If they ask, you have the right to say no, and if they keep pushing, you have the right to block the calls. I looked at him, stunned by the simplicity of his words. The law had not given me what I wanted, but in a way it had given me permission. For years I had believed I was bound, trapped by some invisible contract of duty. Hearing him say it out loud loosened something inside me. Thank you, I whispered. On my way out of his office, I paused on the sidewalk, the winter air crisp against my face. The city buzzed around me, people rushing with scarves, wrapped tight horns honking faintly in the distance. I stood still, breathing in the cold, letting his words replay in my mind. You have the right to say no. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook open. For the first time in years, I wrote not lists of due dates or account numbers, but sentences for myself. You are not their savior. You are allowed to keep your money. You are free to choose peace. The ink flowed steady, and with each line I felt lighter. The next morning, Megan called again. I answered, not out of guilt, but out of curiosity. Her voice was strained, clipped with panic. The bank is moving fast, Emily. They keep throwing around words like foreclosure and auction. I can't keep up. I closed my eyes, picturing her standing in that house, the walls I had once held together now pressing in on her. I am sorry, Megan, I said evenly. I really am. But this is not mine to fix. She went silent for a long time. Finally, she snapped, I knew you'd turn your back. Just wait, Mom and Dad will never forgive you. The line clicked dead. I sat there staring at the phone in my hand, but instead of the familiar rush of guilt, I felt something steadier. Mr. Hayes was right. I was free. Later that week, I returned to the community center to help with an after-school program. As I moved among the kids, showing them how to hold a paintbrush, how to blend colors, I felt the knots inside me loosen. Their laughter filled the room, bright and innocent, untouched by the kind of burdens that had weighed me down for so long. When I left that evening, the sky was streaked with pink and gold, the kind of sunset that makes you stop for just a moment. I stood there, my bag slung over my shoulder, breathing in the cool air. For once, I was not rushing to a bank, not hurrying to fix a broken pipe, not racing to save anyone but myself. The calls would come again, I was sure of it. The demands, the pleas, the accusations. But I carried Mr. Hayes's words like armor. No matter what they threw at me, I had the right to stand my ground. And standing there on that quiet street, I realized I was stronger than I had ever believed. It started on a Sunday afternoon when I logged into Facebook for the first time in weeks. I had only planned to check a message from a former coworker, but the moment the page loaded, I froze. At the top of my feed was my mother's profile picture, framed by one of those flowery borders she loved. Her post was long, dramatic, and public. It read like a confession, though it was anything but. It breaks my heart when a child turns away from her family. Robert and I are sick and aging, and when we needed her most, Emily abandoned us. The house is at risk, the bank is circling, and she has chosen silence. After everything we sacrificed for her, this is how we are repaid. My stomach dropped. The post had already been shared dozens of times with comments piling up beneath it. Neighbors I knew, family, friends from church, even people I had not spoken to in years were leaving words of sympathy for my parents. Prayers, encouragements, and thinly veiled judgment toward me, the ungrateful daughter. I scrolled down my hands, trembling, until I saw my father's post. His words were shorter but sharper. "We thought Emily loved us, but she turned her back. The house will be taken and she acts like it is nothing." And then came Megan's. "Some people only help when it makes them look good. But when it really matters, when family asks for support, they suddenly discover boundaries. I guess that is what passes for strength now." My chest burned as if someone had poured hot coals inside me. I could have ignored it, let them have their stage, but years of silence rose up in me like a tide. I had been quiet too long, swallowing every slight, every dismissal, every erased sacrifice. That night I opened my laptop and began typing. My fingers moved steadily, no hesitation. I wrote plainly with no decoration. My family has shared their version of the story. Here is mine. I attached a photograph of the will with Megan's name as the sole beneficiary. I added scanned copies of the mortgage payments I had made in my name, the utility bills tied to my account, the insurance receipts. Finally, I uploaded the last text from my mother asking for money. I ended my post with one line. My silence was not consent. It was waiting for the right moment to speak. That moment is now. I hit publish and sat back in my chair, my heart pounding in my ears. 10 minutes later, the first comment appeared. "Emily, you did all this. I had no idea." An old friend from college wrote, "You are one of the kindest people I know. Do not let anyone make you doubt that." More comments followed one after another, people tagging others, sharing my post, adding their voices. Some were shocked, some angry on my behalf, some simply offering quiet words of support. By midnight, the post had been shared over 100 times. My notifications exploded, but I felt no panic. Instead, I felt something close to justice, like a beam of sunlight breaking through years of storm clouds. The next morning, I woke to messages from people I barely remembered, neighbors from childhood, old coworkers. Many of them wrote that they had always wondered how Megan managed to live so recklessly, and now it all made sense. A few apologized for believing the story my parents had told. I sat at my kitchen table, reading each message carefully, letting the words sink in. For the first time in years, I was not the one being silenced. My truth had a voice. Later that day, I checked my parents' profiles again. My mother's post was gone. My father's account had been deactivated. Megan had changed her profile picture to a black and white flower, her favorite dramatic gesture whenever things slipped out of her control. I did not smile, but I did not cry either. I simply closed the laptop and leaned back, listening to the rain tapping against the window. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something I had never allowed myself before. Vindication. But I knew this battle was not over. Families like mine rarely surrendered with grace. The next move would come, I was certain, and I braced myself for whatever form it would take. The following morning began with a flood of notifications lighting up my phone. I sat on the edge of my bed, the glow of the screen casting shadows across the room. Dozens of comments had piled onto my post overnight. Some came from people I barely knew, high school classmates, neighbors from my old block in Salem. Their words ranged from surprise to outrage. One woman wrote that she always wondered why Megan seemed to float through life without consequences. Another admitted she had believed my parents' version at first, but now felt ashamed for judging me. I scrolled slowly, letting each message sink in. For so long I had carried my truth in silence, convinced no one would ever see me. Now it felt as though the curtain had been pulled back and the world was finally glimpsing what lay beneath. At work later that day, Olivia, one of my closest colleagues, stopped me in the hallway. She touched my arm gently and said she had read every word of my post. "Emily, people needed to hear that. I know it must have been hard, but you were brave." I felt my throat tighten as I nodded. "Thank you," I whispered, realizing how rarely I heard those words directed at me. By lunchtime, the story had spread even further. Friends tagged me in threads, others defended me in comment sections, where relatives of my parents tried to twist the narrative again. It was strange watching strangers fight over my life, but for the first time the scale was tipping in my favor. That evening I logged in to check again, and saw that my mother's profile had gone silent. Her earlier posts were gone, leaving only flower photos and Bible verses. My father's account no longer existed. Megan had gone dark except for the single black and white flower as her profile picture. That image stared back at me like a mask of martyrdom. The silence from them was louder than any words. In the days that followed, messages continued to arrive from people who had lived near us for years. Some admitted they had always suspected something was off, that Megan's lifestyle never matched the story my parents told about her working so hard. One neighbor wrote that she remembered seeing me out in the cold fixing the gutter while my sister sat inside on her phone. Reading her memory felt like a validation I had craved for decades. Still, there were others who clung to the old story. A distant cousin accused me of humiliating the family publicly. Another scolded me for airing dirty laundry online. Their words stung for a moment, but they no longer pierced me the way they once would have. I had armor now. One night, as I sat in my quiet apartment, a message arrived from someone unexpected. It was Brian Collins, a classmate from high school who now worked as a real estate agent. He wrote that he had seen my post and understood more than I realized. He mentioned that he had recently heard chatter in his office about a property on Vine Street, my parents' home, being flagged as high risk for foreclosure. "Emily," he typed carefully, "I just want you to know people are talking. It might get listed soon." I read his words twice, my chest heavy. It was one thing to imagine the house slipping away, another to hear it spoken of in professional terms reduced to a transaction. I thanked him politely and set the phone down. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Memories came in fragments. Painting the living room walls a soft blue because my mother wanted a fresh start. Spending a Saturday on the roof, with my father replacing shingles one by one. Watching Megan breeze in and out, never lifting a hand yet, still being celebrated as if she had done it all. The ache was sharp, but it was no longer paralyzing. The following weekend, I stopped by the coffee shop near the river, where I sometimes wrote in my journal. As I sipped my drink, a woman approached my table. I recognized her face from years ago, one of our old neighbors. She smiled kindly and said she had read my post. "Emily, I always wondered how you managed to stay so composed all these years. You deserved better." Her words lingered with me long after she left. I realized that people were not only seeing the truth of my family's betrayal, they were also seeing me. Not as the fixer, not as the silent supporter, but as a person who had endured and chosen to stand tall. That night I scrolled through my notifications one last time before bed. The noise was beginning to die down. My post had traveled far, reached many, but the storm was passing. My parents had gone quiet. Megan had retreated. The battle of words had ended, not with an apology but with exposure. I closed my laptop and turned off the light. The apartment filled with darkness, but it was not heavy, it was calm. For the first time I understood that telling the truth had given me something I never thought possible. I did not need their recognition anymore. I had my own. The call came from Brian a few days later while I was setting up the classroom for a photography workshop. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of someone who knew they were about to deliver news that would land hard. "Emily, I thought you should hear it from me," he said. "Your parents' house just hit our listing board. 380,000. No offers yet." I leaned against the counter, pressing the phone tighter to my ear. My mind immediately pictured the house on Vine Street, the brick walls I had patched, the gutters. I had cleaned the rooms I had filled with warmth, long after my parents stopped noticing. It felt strange to hear it reduced to a number, a property, a transaction waiting to be signed. Brian hesitated before adding, "It's in rough shape, Emily. The inspection notes mention the roof, electrical wiring, even the plumbing." He paused. "I figured you already knew that." I nodded, though he could not see me. I knew. I had been the one climbing ladders, writing checks, tightening bolts. Without me, the cracks had widened, and now the house wore its neglect openly. "Thank you for telling me, Brian," I said quietly. "I mean it." After I hung up, I finished arranging the tables, but my thoughts drifted all afternoon. Karma had a strange way of circling back. For years, I had been the invisible thread holding that house together, and now that thread was gone. The unraveling was swift and public. Later that evening, I sat at my desk scrolling through real estate listings until I found it. There it was, 218 Vine Street, displayed with glossy photos that looked harsher than honest. The roof sagged under years of rain, the siding showed water stains, and the backyard fence leaned dangerously. I clicked through the photos, each one a reminder of my labor. The kitchen counter I had installed. The bathroom tiles I had grouted until my knees ached. All of it now described blandly as in need of repair. I closed the laptop and rubbed my temples. The ache inside me was not satisfaction. It was something heavier, almost mournful. That house had been more than bricks and beams. It had been my prison and my proof, the stage for every sacrifice that was never acknowledged. Seeing it laid bare to strangers felt like both an ending and a strange kind of justice. The next day, Mrs. Thompson called. Her voice carried that same mix of concern and curiosity she always had. "Emily, I don't mean to gossip, but I've noticed Megan back at the house lately. She's been doing the grocery runs, carrying heavy bags, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else." I thanked her, then hung up and stared at the wall. Megan, the one who had been shielded from responsibility her whole life, now stuck in the very mess she had inherited. I could almost picture her trying to juggle bills, pretending she had it under control, while the weight pressed harder every day. Part of me ached for her. Part of me wanted to step in and guide her through it. But then I remembered the look on her face when she had come to my door expecting me to rescue her yet again. I remembered the way she had called me selfish, and I knew stepping back was the only choice that made sense. That weekend, I walked downtown and stopped at a small cafe. I sat by the window with a notebook, watching people pass by, bundled against the winter air. My pen moved across the page almost on its own. I wrote about the years of patching and paying, about the hollow silence of being erased, about the strange relief of no longer carrying the weight. As I wrote, I realized my story was no longer about the house, or even about the will. It was about boundaries, about the moment I stopped equating love with self-destruction. When I left the cafe, the late afternoon light was fading, and I passed a real estate office with listings taped in the window. My parents' house was there, printed on cheap paper, the photo of the sagging roof staring back at me. I stopped staring at it while people brushed past me on the sidewalk. For a moment, I felt the sting of grief. But then slowly the grief shifted into something steadier. The house had always reflected the truth of our family. It looked fine from the outside, but inside, it had been patched, hidden, covered, until the damage could no longer be ignored. Now stripped of my labor, it showed itself for what it was. I turned away from the window and kept walking, the sound of my boots on the pavement grounding me. I carried no guilt in that moment, only clarity. That night, I curled up in bed with a blanket and let the silence of my apartment surround me. My phone sat face down on the nightstand. No buzzing, no pleading messages, no emergencies. The stillness was strange, but it felt like a beginning, not an absence. I closed my eyes and told myself that whatever came next, whether the house sold or crumbled, whether Megan stumbled or learned, it was no longer my story to carry. A letter arrived in my mailbox on a gray Tuesday afternoon, tucked among grocery flyers and utility statements. The handwriting on the envelope stopped me in my tracks. I recognized it instantly, the looping script my mother had used on birthday cards and school permission slips decades ago. My hands trembled as I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it like it was some relic unearthed from another life. For a long time I did not open it. I made tea, watered the plant on the windowsill, even wiped down the counters. But the envelope waited, quiet and insistent. Finally, I slid a knife under the flap and unfolded the single sheet inside. Her words spilled across the page, uneven and desperate. She wrote about sleepless nights, about my father's health fading, about bills stacked so high she could not see a way forward. She wrote that she never meant to hurt me, that she thought I would always be strong enough to stand on my own. She said she regretted how the will was written, that she wished she could change it now, but the mess was too deep. At the bottom, she wrote, "I don't know how much time we have left to fix this, but if you are willing, I am still here." I sat back in my chair, the words blurring. A part of me longed to fold the letter against my chest, to let it mean something more than desperation. But beneath every line I heard the same pattern. Need, expectation. My strength treated as currency, my silence mistaken for agreement. I folded the letter again and slipped it into the desk drawer beside a stack of old photographs and unfinished drafts. I could not tear it, but I could not answer it either. The next morning I threw myself into work. The high school photography class I had been teaching had its first small exhibit at the community center. Watching the students pin their prints to the corkboard walls filled me with pride I had never known. Their faces lit with joy as parents and neighbors stopped to admire their work. For once I was surrounded by people who saw effort and responded with encouragement, not expectation. Later at a friend's cafe, I displayed a small collection of my own photographs. They were simple images, but they told a quiet story of healing. A park bench dusted with snow, sunlight glinting on cracked pavement, an elderly woman's hands cupped around a steaming mug. I had captured them in moments when I was relearning how to see the world not as duty but as possibility. When the exhibit opened, a middle-aged woman lingered in front of one of my prints, a single flower fallen on a broken sidewalk. She turned to me, eyes shining, and said softly, "I don't know why, but this feels like it's speaking for someone who has been quiet for a long time." Her words struck me deeper than she could have known. I smiled, thanking her, but inside I felt an ache of recognition. That was me. That had been my life. In the weeks that followed, I wrote more than I ever had. Not long rants or bitter recounts, but reflections, essays on boundaries, on love that does not demand self-destruction, on the strength it takes to walk away. I posted some online, and to my surprise, they were shared widely. Messages came in from strangers, women and men who whispered their own stories of being the forgotten one, the one who always gave but was never named. I realized then that what I had carried was not mine alone. The silence I broke was one shared by so many others. Still, my parents' presence hovered like a shadow at the edge of my days. Their house appeared again, on a real estate site price, dropped 30,000 urgency, stamped in bold red letters. The photos looked harsher, each time the decay more obvious, as though the house itself was tired of pretending. Neighbors called occasionally with updates. Mrs. Thompson mentioned she saw Megan hauling groceries with a scowl, her energy drained. Another neighbor said, "My father seemed frailer, his steps slower." Each time I listened politely, but when I hung up, I forced myself to release it. I could not carry their weight again, no matter how familiar it felt. One rainy afternoon, I walked around Liberty Lake with my new camera. The golden light of dusk cut through the bare branches, casting soft beams across the water. A boy ran along the path, his mother laughing behind him, calling out in joy. I raised my camera and caught the moment, the blur of freedom and love unburdened. Standing there, damp from the drizzle, my camera warm in my hands, I felt a peace I had never known in that old house on Vine Street. I realized I no longer needed to prove my worth through sacrifice. My life was finally mine to shape. When I returned home, I slipped the memory card into my laptop and watched the image fill the screen. The boy's laughter frozen mid-step, the mother's joy captured in the curve of her smile. It was everything I had lost and everything I had found. The letter from my mother still sat in the drawer unanswered. I knew it would remain there, tucked away with fragments of a life I had outgrown. That night, as the rain tapped softly on the windows, I understood something I had resisted for years. Family was not just blood, not just the ones who named or erased you in a will. Family was anyone who saw you, valued you, and chose you. And even if no one else did, I finally had the courage to choose myself. Spring came slowly, with soft winds carrying the scent of new blossoms through the streets of Spokane. My days were filled with work, with teaching, with long walks where I carried my camera and captured the way sunlight spilled across empty benches or glinted off the river. Each click of the shutter felt like a reminder that life had turned a page. The silence from my parents stretched on. No calls, no texts, no more letters. At first it felt eerie, as though I was waiting for the next shoe to drop. But as the weeks passed, that silence shifted into something steadier. It was no longer a void. It was space. One afternoon, as I sat in my apartment editing photographs, an email alert flashed on my screen. It was from a real estate site I had nearly forgotten I subscribed to. The subject line made my heart skip. Price reduced again, 218 Vine Street. I hesitated before opening it, then clicked. The listing was still there, though the asking price had dropped by another $20,000. The photos were the same, but they seemed to look sadder with each reduction, like the house itself had given up trying to stand tall. I closed the email and leaned back. That house no longer held me. It no longer defined me. It was just a building standing as a monument to choices that were not mine to make. The following weekend, my students hosted another exhibit at the community center. Parents, teachers, neighbors came in to see what the kids had created. Their faces glowed with pride as they explained the stories behind their photos. I walked among them, listening, encouraging, feeling something grow inside me that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with joy. After the event, Olivia found me in the hallway. She smiled and said she had been reading my blog. "Emily, your words are reaching people. They feel less alone because of you." Her words touched me more than I expected. For so long, I had been silenced in my own family, told my feelings were overreactions, dismissed like I was invisible. Now my voice carried not in anger but in truth, and it was enough. Weeks later, another envelope came in the mail, this time from the county clerk's office. I opened it carefully and found a notice of foreclosure filed on Vine Street. The house was being auctioned. My first instinct was to feel pity, but it quickly faded. Choices had consequences, and I had carried theirs for far too long. That night, I walked along the riverfront. The sky was painted in shades of gold and lavender, the water rippling softly. I thought of all the nights I had lain awake in that house, worrying about bills, about pipes, bursting, about holding everything together. Now I walked freely with no weight on my shoulders but the evening air. I did not hate my parents. I did not even hate Megan. I simply understood that they had chosen a life where they could lean on me until I broke, and I had chosen to stop breaking. In the months that followed, I traveled for the first time in years. I went to Seattle to photograph the changing leaves in the fall, then down to Portland to visit an old friend. Each trip felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had buried under sacrifice. I started saving for a new camera lens, something I would have once considered indulgent, but now I saw it as an investment in the life I wanted. Sometimes I would think back to that will, to the cold ink that had erased me. I realize now it had given me something unexpected. Freedom. Because being cut out forced me to step out, to finally stop tying my worth to people who never saw it. As the first anniversary of that New Year's Day approached, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea, looking through the photographs I had taken in the past year. They told a story not of loss but of becoming. A boy running by the lake. A mother's laughter echoing behind him. A flower blooming through a crack in the pavement. Each image carried a piece of me, the part that had survived and chosen to live. I knew my parents' lives had shrunk, weighed down by their own choices. I knew Megan was still tangled in her old habits, but none of that belonged to me anymore. My story had moved on. I closed my laptop, pulled the blanket around my shoulders, and whispered a truth I finally believed. I was not the forgotten daughter. I was the one who found her voice. Now, I want to ask you, what do you think of my choice? Was stepping away the only way I could protect myself, or would you have handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe and stay with me for more stories about family justice and finding strength in places you least expect.